Rome's glory shone for 1,000 years. But nothing lasts forever. In the 3rd century AD, civil war engulfed the empire. Chaos and corruption undermined it from within. And from every direction, its enemies gathered for the kill. Panic spread as terrified Romans sensed the apocalypse at hand. For hundreds of years, the benefits of Roman rule seemed clear. Her army created the most stable empire the world had ever known. From Scotland to the Sahara, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, everyone enjoyed the blessings of Rome's peace. Her government gave the Mediterranean centuries of community, stability, and prosperity. For hundreds of years, it was good to be Roman. But that wouldn't last.
Our history now descends from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. Cassius Dio.
Emperor Marcus Aurelius presided over the first signs of decline in the Roman world. Born in 121 AD, he was groomed from an early age to be Rome's next emperor. Aurelius had 20 years to dream about the kind of ruler he wanted to be and the kind of empire he wanted to rule. As a Roman, he believed there was a divine order to things. As emperor, he hoped to recreate that order in the Roman world, which is what Romans had done for centuries with astounding success everywhere. They pacified the entire Mediterranean with one set of laws, regulated trade with one currency, replaced diversity with conformity. Rome's empire stretched for 2 million square miles, but whether you were in Egypt or England, you could always travel a straight Roman road to a familiar Roman city. Romans liked to know where they stood. They planned their cities like they planned their lives, in a methodical, orderly fashion. If nature was unpredictable, they tamed it. Romans channeled water to their cities in massive aqueducts, arguably their greatest logistical triumph. Rome had been a symbol of order and stability for centuries. And Marcus Aurelius expected to continue that tradition. In 161 AD, Aurelius finally became emperor. For 23 years, he'd been planning a peaceful rule. He was in for a brutal awakening. Later that year, war broke out in the east. Barbarians crossed the frontier and attacked a Roman province. A deadly plague ravaged the empire, killing 1/4 of Rome's population. Germanic invaders then exploited the disaster and attacked from the north. Rome was suddenly confronted with military threats on 2 fronts. Marcus Aurelius spent 8 years on the frontiers fighting for Rome's survival. Like many, he feared it was the beginning of the end, that the great Roman Empire was about to fall to an invading army. But his fears were misplaced. For Rome's greatest problems lay within, as did the emperor's. Marcus Aurelius had cancer. He took daily doses of a drug he hoped would alleviate his suffering. It didn't. And in 180 AD, the disease finally won. Aurelius's painful death foreshadowed the fate of the empire he left behind. Rome, too, was suffering from a fatal disease: cultural decay. It was an erosion of traditional Roman values that would force many to turn to foreign cults for their salvation and question their allegiance to Rome. The Roman Empire is as famous for its vices as it is for its virtues. Corrupted by wealth and power, Rome's legacy was tainted by images of indulgence and imperial excess. The Emperor Commodus epitomized the decay. His arrogance would force everyone to question their allegiance to Rome. Commodus succeeded his father Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD. Traumatized by an early attempt on his life, Commodus shunned all public appearances and left Rome in the hands of his closest advisors. As they terrorized Rome, Commodus amused himself in the palace. It was a lifestyle funded by corruption and extortion. Resentment festered throughout the empire. In 190 AD, the poor rioted. They thought Commodus had deliberately hoarded grain to inflate its price and increase his profits.
Trajan was the last Roman emperor to substantially add to the empire. Under his rule, in 117, the Roman Empire reached 2 million square miles. From this point, Rome concentrated on shoring up its empire. The days of conquest were over. It was Emperor Hadrian who formalized this policy.
Hadrian gets a sense of unease that he has pushed the empire out to its limits, and he did two things. He pulled he pulled the army back from its overextension, and then he built a series of beautifully engineered fortifications.
The most famous of these barriers is Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, where remains of the 73-mile-long chain of forts still stand nearly 2,000 years later. But walls proved only partially successful against a threat tormenting the Roman Empire. The Romans have a single word for people without a written language: barbarians. German tribes attacking Rome's borders in 166 marked a bleak milestone. For the first time since Hannibal's invasion, the Roman Empire was on the defensive. For the next century, waves of migrating peoples followed the Germans into Roman territory. Goths, Franks, Persians, Parthians, Visigoths, and others. The edges of the empire crumbled until there was no more Roman Empire to penetrate. By the 3rd century, barbarians were only one of the empire's mounting crises. It was a time when an emperor was far more likely to be assassinated than die of old age, and rulers frequently left no clear successor to their throne. Once again, the affections of the individual legions became central to political power.
There came a point where the loyalty of the army became suspect, particularly in the 3rd century AD, when the empire, faced by barbarian incursions on the frontiers, faced by plague, by rampant inflation, some armies proclaimed their own commanders emperor and then marched on Rome, trying to seize power.
Feuding legions proclaimed 30 different emperors in a period of just 23 years. Civil wars broke out frequently over who was truly ruling the empire. Meanwhile, Rome's impressive record in battle began to slip. Apparently, the great legions had lost their edge. The low point came in 260. Emperor Valerian has spent his entire career fighting the Persians to the east with limited success. With his troops ravaged by war and disease, he was forced to do something no emperor had ever done: negotiate. But when Valerian arrived in modern-day Iraq to talk peace, he was taken prisoner. The emperor of the Roman Empire was made to kneel on the ground before his conquerors, so the Persian king Shapur could step on his neck. It was a devastating blow to Roman pride. It was not quite the end for Rome, but it was the beginning of the end. The Roman legions were no longer the invincible fighting machine that once conquered the world. The frontiers of the empire were no longer impenetrable, and Rome could no longer be said to rule the world. Less than a century after the first barbarians crossed into the empire, one Roman recognized this momentous time for what it was.
Our history now plunges from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust.
Romans yearned for one of the great emperors of the past to take control. Julius Caesar, an Augustus, a Hadrian. Romans wondered how their great empire could have fallen to such a shameful state of affairs. Some believed it was the long-awaited fulfillment of the Sibylline oracles, a series of apocalyptic prophecies that had haunted Rome for centuries. But there was nothing mystical about the chaos of the 3rd century. Quite simply, the empire had become unmanageable. Emperors could no longer cope with the monster Rome had become. Political power was concentrated in too few hands. The wealthy were forgetting the old democratic ideals, balancing the power of rulers with the needs of ordinary citizens. Rome had turned its back on the common man. Destitute families flooded into the city, swelling the ranks of sweatshop workers and the urban poor. Intent on distracting themselves, most Romans didn't notice the social fabric of their empire shredding all around them. Rome's sense of community had disappeared. The elite were increasingly isolated from the poor. Educated Romans were turning their backs on everything to do with old Rome, not just the poor. The East, ancient, mysterious, and exotic, seemed much more enticing. Wealthy Romans headed off to see the sights of Egypt. The world's first tourist boom had begun. Romans marveled at the wonders of Egypt, and like tourists in centuries to come, scratched graffiti to record their visits.
Egypt was a land of magic and mystery. It had the pyramids, it had hieroglyphs, it had the Nile. And Romans, they went to Egypt much more often in fantasy, in pictures, by bringing the wild animals of Egypt from Egypt into Rome, hippopotamuses, crocodiles. But some of them, probably on lazy culture trips, went as far as they could, right to the boundaries of Ethiopia.
As travelers abroad marveled at the mysteries of Egypt, Romans back home were hungry for their own taste of the mysterious East. A luxury trade in expensive foreign goods flourished.
There is this exotica that the rich and wealthy came to expect. Perhaps one of the most startling examples would be spices. They came from the Far East, from the islands of Indonesia. Even more than that, we've got a guide written for shippers up the Red Sea on how to cross over using the monsoon to India to pick up goods. And it tells you what you can get in the Yemen, at Bombay, on the southern tip of India, where there may very well have been a colony of Roman citizens.
The Roman delight in far-flung places was not reciprocated. As Rome thrilled to the exotic East was starting to hate Rome's guts. In the provinces and periphery of empire, resentment festered. From the beginning, Rome had built its empire by conquest and force of arms. In the early days of empire, there had been real benefits to being defeated by Rome. Citizenship, civil rights, trade, and prosperity. But by the 3rd century AD, those benefits were evaporating. Citizenship was giving way to slavery. Peace and prosperity replaced by shameless exploitation. Rome was sitting on a powder keg of poverty and resentment.